This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times no matter when.
Okay, hi everyone. Happy Valentine's Day. Today we're going to Venice and we're going to be in the presence of beautiful women, mostly beautiful women. I can't only show you beautiful women. And I have to admit that this was probably the hardest class for me to organize. One, because I have to finish with marriage, and two, because of the proliferation of images of women in particularly in 16th century Venice. And I'm going to show that to you. I'm certainly not showing you all the beautiful women that were painted in 16th century Venice, but I'm going to show you that several images had multiple versions, and we can talk about why that would be. But first, we're staying in the world of Venice or nearby, with finishing up with our marriage imagery, which is actually a great introduction to images of Venetian women. So we ended without discussing with this marriage portrait by Lorenzo Lotto of Messer Marsilio and his wife Faustina. And it's pretty obvious for what it is, as he is about to place the ring on her finger. But did you know that in the Renaissance, it was believed that in that third finger, or the ring finger, had a vein that led directly to the heart? That comes from San Isidro of Seville. So that is the whole, I guess, the origin of that being the engagement ring and marriage ring finger. So again, this image pretty much explains itself. We know it was commissioned by Marsilio's father, Zakin, in 1523 to celebrate the marriage of his son to Faustina Assonica. And it was a marrying up because Faustina was a member of a patrician Bergamese family from Bergamo. She unfortunately died 5 years after their marriage in 1528. I'm sure it was complications of childbirth. And her father-in-law, or Marsilio's father, was an astute businessman, and we have documents in which he was negotiating the price down from 30 to 20 scudi. So he was in the silk and the fabric business, and so he wasn't going to pay more than he needed to. And this portrait, as most marital portraits would do, celebrates the social status, the wealth of the family. And we can see that in her pearls, in the pendant, in the cameo hanging from the pearls, in her elaborate snood, in the ring going on her finger, in the voluptuous sleeves of her dress, which is red for passion, marriage, and hoped for fertility. Pearls, in fact, were often called vinculum amoris, or bonds of love. And she also has one of those golden chains lower on her breast, which is also related to marriage jewelry. But I think the most obvious explanation is that Cupid, a rather humorous Cupid, we could say, is binding these two with a yoke, and kind of looking askance at Marsilio, because perhaps the father thought that Marsilio was too young to get married at 21, because it was much more customary for men to get married in their later 20s, 28, or even 30, to a much, much younger bride. So these two look actually somewhat similar in their ages. And so, this is, it documents that, hey, Marsilio and Faustina, you're going to be bonded for life. Not that long, only 5 years. Now, we also know that Lorenzo Lotto was commissioned to paint several works for the Cassotti. In fact, we know that Lotto painted 5, but only those for his son Marsilio have survived. So I show you Lotto's mystical marriage of St. Catherine, which also hung in the nuptial bedroom. So if you think back to our marriage class, where we looked at both Botticelli's Birth of Venus and the Madonna adoring the child, and at the Primavera, which was painted along with Camilla and the Centaur and the Madonna of the Magnificat, this should come as no surprise that in the wedding chamber, you had here a portrait of the bridal couple, and you had a religious image of the Madonna, also dressed in red, unusually, and with St. Catherine reaching toward the hand of Jesus for the marriage of St. Catherine of Alexandria to the infant Jesus. So totally appropriate. We bring religion into the scene of marriage and procreation. But what we aren't seeing, which I think may be a fun discovery, when I was looking at this image, it hangs in the Met. It is truly an odd image. And remember, I always say if something is odd, we better think about it and look carefully. So here is Venus and Cupid. Cupid, another naughty Cupid, Lorenzo Lotto seems to like his Cupids to be naughty, is urinating through a laurel or myrtle wreath. It's a little hard to identify the plant. We know that myrtle refers to marriage and laurel to fame and kind of eternity or victory. And so the image of peeing through the wreath, of course, is a reference to fertility. And of course, if you follow the train of urine, it is going where the sperm would be supposed to be going. Other symbolism is the ivy on the tree behind her, also a symbol of fidelity, and the roses scattered on her and beside her, images of love and the flower of Venus, so identifying her along with Cupid as Venus. You also see a creepy little snake slithering onto the blue cloth, which clearly is an image of danger. Perhaps this is art historians fantasizing, warning against jealousy. I rather think it's a reference to the Garden of Eden, for a warning to the bride not to be too bold and to be tempted and get the couple expelled from the Garden of Eden. And this seems to relate to a whole revival of wedding poems called epithalamia, I guess, which have their sources in antiquity as verses composed to celebrate a marriage. I think last week I read you a rather racy one, and this was something that was revived in the Renaissance. And again, she's wearing a crown with pearls and unusually an earring. Earrings did not come into fashion until after the 1530s. So we have to think about why she has a single earring also. And of course, over her head is a conch shell, rather sexually elusive, suggestive. And most of all, she's an odd looking Venus. She doesn't look like most 16th century artists' versions of Venus. And if you read the Met catalog, they assume that this is a portrait. So I just happened to be looking at this image right after the marriage portrait, and I'm going to show you what I think. I think this is the missing painting from the bedroom, and that Venus is the same as Faustina. Oh, and I forgot to mention here, you can see a close-up of the cameo, which is an image of Faustina, who in Roman tradition was considered the ideal wife. So we have the perfect wife, and then we have the sexy image to ensure procreation. And that sexy image, of course, has the specific reference to fertility. So I'm just going to leave you with this. this is my new theory that these three paintings were commissioned by Zakin for the wedding of his son to Faustina. And this is in keeping with what we learned last week, where you have to have religion, sex, and bonding. So let me know what you think. And when I get brave enough, I have a cousin who works at the Met. I'll send her an email saying, what do you think? But now we move on to probably one of the most famous images of a reclining nude figure, here known as the Venus of Urbino, because of course a nude female cannot just be a nude female. She has to be justified by being Venus. And this, of course, was the source for Manet's Olympia. And this painting appalled Mark Twain. And I just had to share this wonderful quote. You enter the Uffizi and proceed to that most visited little gallery that exists in the world, the Tribune. And there, against the wall, without obstructing wrap or leaf, you may look your fill upon the foulest, the vilest, the obscenest picture the world possesses, Titian's Venus. It isn't that she is naked and stretched out on a bed. No, it is the attitude of one of her arms and hand. If I ventured to describe that attitude, there would be a fine howl. But there the Venus lies for anybody to gloat over that wants to, and there she has a right to lie, for she is a work of art, and art has its privileges. Well, we don't need anything more than that quote to understand why art historians have struggled with these images and wanted to identify all these sensuous, sometimes nude women as courtesans, because that's the only way, if you have this perspective on this painting, that you can understand it. Now, remember, last week we learned that Agricola believed that in order to get pregnant, the woman had to reach orgasm as well. So there's a different way of understanding this picture than the Mark Twain version. Now, because she's been called Venus, that means we don't know who she is, and there are multiple possibilities to the patronage scenario. So I show you here Titian's Venus flanked by two gentlemen. The one on the left is Titian's portrait of Guido Baldo II, the Duke of Urbino. And so one possibility is that Guido Baldo della Rovere commissioned this painting, or perhaps even his father, commissioned this painting to celebrate his 1534 marriage to Giulia Varano, who in 1534 was only 10. She didn't come initially to Urbino. She came when she reached the age of 14 to consummate her marriage. So this would be one of those images hanging in their bedroom to ensure a successful consummation. Or another possibility, it is a portrait of the courtesan Angelica Zaffetti, painted for Ippolito de' Medici. And I'm just going to say aside, Ippolito was a weird guy. He had kind of a menagerie, and I shouldn't be using that word, a menagerie of humans of different colors. A collection, kind of like a circus. So he was a little odd. But we have a document, a letter from Titian in 1534, who wrote to Ippolito's chamberlain saying that he had been working on a painting of a woman for Cardinal Ippolito. And Cardinal Ippolito then died in 1535. So a painting of a woman does not tell us who that woman was, or whether she was a portrait. In 1538, Guido Baldo goes to Venice to have his portrait painted by Titian. You see this is a later one. The one on the left is in Yale. And we have a letter in which he says he saw the portrait and wanted to buy it, which he did, calling it a nude woman. So this really doesn't tell us that much. We know that Ippolito bought a painting of a nude woman by Titian in 1538. Well, as you will see, there are plenty of nude women painted by Titian. So that does not mean, or does not tell me, that this reclining figure is the courtesan Angela Zavetta, because neither identifies that specifically, but we know that Angela Zavetta was the courtesan of choice of Ippolito. So let's keep going. That later we find out, or then I found out, that Guidobaldo was forced to marry Julia Verona. Now, this is unusual. Usually it's the poor female that has to marry against her will. But we have a letter to his father telling his father that he was in love with Clarice Orsini. And here's an excerpt from his letter. "For 2 years now, I have spoken at length, begging you that in giving me a wife, it would seem that in this act, the principal matter is to satisfy me, given that I carried and still carry such a love for the lady Clarice, due to her qualities and her manners. To let me have her would give me such extreme happiness, and not to have her would cause me such infinite sadness. So I beg you with all my heart, if you have any regard for my sanity and health, satisfy and concede me this favor, knowing that in her is my all." All right. So poor Guidobaldo did not get his wish. He was, in fact, forced to marry Giulia Varano, the only child of Giovanni Maria da Varano, the Duke of Camerino. And this was a dynastic linking of Camerino, the dukeship of Camerino, to that of Urbino. And when Giovanni Maria da Varano died in 1527, he only had one heir, and that was Giulia, who succeeded him as the sovereign Duchess of Camerino, and with her mother Caterina Cibo acting as her regent. And they promised her to Guidobaldo, the heir to the Duchy of Urbino. Well, it was complicated because, of course, the papacy didn't want Camerino to go to Urbino. So Paul III opposed the marriage, wanting her to marry his grandson, Ottavio Farnese. So these poor women were absolute pawns, but ultimately she was married to Guidobaldo. And then later she had to return Camerino to the Papal States. All right, so on the left, you see Titian's portrait of Giulia Verano from about 1545. But we know that Titian never met Giulia Verano. We're pretty sure that he painted the portrait based on verbal descriptions and probably using clothing that was sent to him. We know that armor was sent to him when he was painting Della Rovere's father. And this possibly was the dress she was buried in when she died in 1547. Now, some people believe that the Titian's portrait of Giulia Verano is actually the same person, older, as the Venus of Urbino. I think that's a stretch, but it's an interesting idea, because I am probably more, I believe more likely that Titian's Venus, I'll go back to her, is a marriage portrait, so, or a marriage image to hang in the bedroom. I would say here, to persuade Guidobaldo that he needs to love Giulia Verana rather than Clarice. And so many of the elements in this painting are marriage related. The roses are images of love and Venus's love. The hair being down is that of a bride. The sleeping dog, an image of fidelity, so different than that arching cat in the Manet painting. And then the servants in the background digging around in marriage cassone to get the clothing for the nude female. And the potted plant is seemingly a myrtle bush. So it seems more likely that this is one of many images that was painted to adorn a marriage chamber. And that brings us to women in Venice. And I start by showing you an enormously long woodcut, which is actually at the top of your outline, showing the procession of the Doge. But what I'm not showing it for the guys marching. I'm rather showing it for the display, how women were displayed in public events in Venice. So there you see women crowding into the procuriate windows and even into the niches over the doors. And so it was customary, I think, beyond in Venice and other places as well, to allow women to dress to the nines and to be displayed on important state celebrations as demonstrations of the beauty, the fame, and the greatness of Venice. And they were also encouraged to wear all their most elaborate clothing as kind of advertisements for Venetian wealth and as a center of trade of luxury goods. And this also informs us that women were far more frequently represented in the 16th century. Most likely, and I'm going to share quite a lot of poetry with you today. It was inspired by contemporary literature, poetry, and possibly also theater. And there was a whole new vision of women, and they became images that were very popularly collected. And it's something that we need to talk about and think about. And they were typically called beautiful women, belle donne. And I just give you a closer view here, because the next few images I'm going to show you relate very much to the way Botticelli displayed these women from kind of the shoulder up or the waist up in an enclosed space. So keep this woodcut in mind when we look at the next few images. But I also want to remind you that Venice was a woman. And I show you only a few of the images of Venice as female. The extraordinary Veronese Triumph of Venice, which is in the great Salone in the Doge's palace. And in fact, she is looking down onto the Doge's throne. She is being crowned by victory, surrounded by fecundity, the goddesses giving her all the wealth of Venice, surrounded by the twisting columns of wisdom, by Venetian patrician women below her, and then an image of Venice triumphant over Europe with the captives below. So an extraordinary image of Venice as an enthroned, beautiful blonde woman. In addition, going back into the 14th and 15th century, Venice was often displayed as justice, as you see in the Giacobello del Fiore image of justice on the throne of wisdom, the lion throne holding a sword and the scales. And on the exterior of the Doge's palace is the carved image of Venezia, which is truly identical to the image of justice, holding a throne, holding a sword enthroned on a lion throne over the waves. So she calms the waves, and she makes Venice peaceful and triumphant. So I just wanted to remind you that the whole imagery around Venice was female. So that is also probably a reason that the images of women proliferated in Venice. And I show you my favorite, we'll come back to her, Titian's Flora, and absolutely inspired by the poetry of Ariosto, Bembo, Giovanni della Casa, Antonio Tibaldeo, and music. I'm going to play a little excerpt of a madrigal. And all these authors and musicians circulated around Titian. He hung out with all the literati. And it must be in this environment that ideal female beauty was celebrated so profoundly and frequently in 16th century Venice. But we have to go back, because not only was Venice portrayed as a female, Venice was very close to the north as a trading center. And there was a lot of exchange of prints and paintings and artists between Northern Europe and Venice. And I'm showing you here a rather sad painting by Giovanni Bellini, a portrait of a boy, with an interesting inscription that says, "No other way," work of Bellini, Giovanni Bellini, Venetian, no other way. So he couldn't have painted this any differently. And it was part of the lid of an inheritance chest, and probably represents the son of the ambassador to Venice for the King of Naples, who is there in black mourning his father's death. His father died in 1474. This was commissioned by the Venetian government to commemorate the ambassador's death. So an odd object, and you see this three kind of bust view behind a parapet, which is directly related to a series of portraits by Jan van Eyck. The one I show you on the right is typically called the Lille Souvenir portrait. Lille Souvenir means loyal remembrance. There it is dated. And then, which you can't see on the very top, is another inscription, Tum Oteos, which seems to translate meaning then God. And if you go to the National Gallery, they have no idea what that inscription means. But it is fairly certain that the Van Eyck is an image of a deceased sitter. So that this formula of sitter behind parapet, one, makes it clear that this is a painted image of the sitter and not frighteningly alive, because sometimes portraiture, the naturalism of a portrait could be confusing. And that it is a reference to deceased in the connection of these two. Now, apologies, this is not one of my beautiful Venetian women, but I find it fascinating because really what I want to figure out is, why was this painted? For whom? What really does this image represent? It is attributed to the artist Giacometto Veneziano, called The Portrait of a Lady, around 1480 in Philadelphia. It was originally in a double-sided engaged frame, probably with a sliding cover, which would have had an additional motto. On the back, or connected, is this other part you see on the right, which has the inscription, which we think translates, "Satisfy the soul with delights, for after death there is no pleasure," which is supposedly from the tomb of Sardanapalus. If you know the Delacroix painting of the death of Sardanapalus, you understand that it's all about this dissolute and voluptuous and sexual life of Sardanapalus. Or there's another possible translation of the VLLLLF, which is, "He willingly made a vow of love to LL." So here we are in this often conflicted place. Is this a prostitute? Is this a wedding image? Is this an image of love? But then we come back to this image, and certainly she is not beautiful. She really looks like she's been sitting under a sun lamp, which I find really confusing. I don't understand those the white rings around her eyes and the sunburnt nose and cheeks. Her hair seems to be colored, henna colored. She seems to have a receding hairline. Does she have, is she sick? That yellow scarf. Now, we've seen a yellow scarf before. I showed it to you in Lotto's Lucretia. And it is, again, complex and conflicted. We know that courtesans were required to wear yellow scarves in some cities, including Venice. And yellow goes back to the color of shame, linking it to urine, or as I was saying to a friend, the Nazis did their homework when they required the yellow star to be affixed to the clothing of Jews. And I think in Florence, they had to wear yellow discs. And in Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling, in the lunettes of the ancestors, some of the ancestors of Christ, Jews, are also wearing yellow rings on their clothing. So we don't know, is this a portrait? Is this a type? Is this an image of the aging harlot? She has a slightly low-cut dress, gamura. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. You do see a hint of cleavage, and the way that scarf tucks into her cleavage could be alluring, I suppose, but she certainly isn't alluring. So here's my question. Was she, I had to share this horrendous detail with you. After the Venetians defeated Charles VIII at Fornovo in 1495, they recovered a book of portraits of prostitutes raped in various Italian cities that belonged to Charles V. These were portraits that were considered trophies. So could this be something like that, rather kind of like the opposite of galleries of beauties that we know Francis I of France collected? So here's my next question. Was this image paired with something opposite? So just to remind you of Giorgione's most obscure painting of La Vecchia from 1506 with the inscription Col Tempo. So with the passing of time, a beauty becomes an old woman, or the Northern tradition of ill-matched lovers. So I'm just wondering whether this painting of an aging, perhaps sick with syphilis prostitute might have been paired with an image of a beautiful woman and seen as a kind of warning against the passing of time, like the Giorgione, or the more humorous, sarcastic, I guess, images of ill-matched lovers. I promise you, this is the last of the uglies. Well, there's some later ones, but I just find it fascinating, and I wanted you to kind of understand how we go about thinking about these images and how difficult it is for us to reconstruct the context. Much more traditional, another portrait by Giacometto, but the sitters have been difficult to identify, so I'm going to share several different possibilities. Here it is suggested that it's a portrait of Alvise Contarini and a woman, possibly a nun of San Secondo, or possibly not a nun. Possibly this is perfectly secular fashion, although it's slightly unusual to bare the shoulders, particularly if it's a nun. And it, like the one of the previous aging prostitute, was put together in a rather complex construction where these two images fit together in a box. And it has been suggested that perhaps it was to hide their relationship, or I would say it was portable and could be taken on traveling. So perhaps Alvise Contarini or another possible patrician traveled on business and would take these portraits with him. We do have a document, a description by Marc Antonio Michiel in the mid-16th century that says, there is a small portrait of Alvise Contarini, son of, who died some years ago. And on the same little panel, facing the male portrait, a portrait of a nun of San Secondo. And on the cover of these portraits, there is a young doe in a landscape, while on their leather case, foliage stamped with gold. So art historians want to identify images. So because of this description, it has been proposed that that is who these people are. But the image of the woman in particular does not seem very likely to be that of a nun. But the description is pretty clear in that on the back of the male portrait is this image of a roebuck with the inscription Aiei, which in Greek means forever. So it seems to be faithful in love, loyal. The porphyry background of this doe or stag, buck, is possibly funereal from ancient Rome. Porphyry was typically the marble used for funerary monuments. And according to Byzantine tradition, Christ was laid on a porphyry slab. And we have the Petrarch description of the lover as a deer. In addition, we have a quote from the Song of Songs. My beloved is like a roe or a young hart. Behold, he stands behind our wall. He looketh forth at the windows, showing himself through the lattice. So, as Michiel said, this seems to relate to earthly and celestial love, combining biblical and Neoplatonic messages referring to love. So perhaps if that porphyry is funereal, she is not a nun, but perhaps she was a widow and then chose to enter the convent of San Secondo after the death of her husband, and entered the convent without taking orders. And that would make better sense. But there's another element that complicates it all, because on the back of her portrait is a very damaged image of, if you look carefully on the left, that you see there's a male figure seated on the ground with his legs apart, kind of next to a body of water where a gondola is moored near the shoreline. And it is very similar to the coin on the right of Pietro Bembo. And we once again meet the ever-present Pietro Bembo. And we know that Giacometti was close to the Bembo family and painted portraits of both Pietro and his brother Carlo. So possibly, rather than Alvise, I just forgot his name, what was his name? Alvise Contarini, maybe this is Pietro Contarini, and the visiting Frenchman, Marc-Antonio Michiel, just confused which Contarini it was. And in a poem by Pietro, it describes the suffering inflicted on him by a woman through her sweet speech, her humble dress, her beautiful face, hands, arms, and breast, who enjoys seeing him in the middle of his life, almost dying as a doe wounded in its heart. So possibly this relates then to a married couple attached and displayed together, or the deceased husband and the widow who entered the convent, or a clandestine relationship, which I think is highly unlikely, or, as we just saw, a portrait not of Alvise, but of Pietro Contarini, and possibly his muse. So remember Bernardo Bembo and Leonardo's portrait of Ginevra de' Benci, that was platonic love of a poet for his muse. So possibly this is Pietro, who is in love with a virtuous woman, possibly a member of a convent, and that his portrait would fold over hers, and she would then be protected by the male portrait. Again, we don't know, but we do know that there was a whole tradition in the North of lovers' images, and I showed you one, a German one, because it has a fantastic inscription and story. Not a beautiful painting, but one that gives us more context for many of these images. Here is Count Philip von Hanau-Musenberg and his concubine, Margaret Weiskirchner. And Philip began the relationship with Margaret after the death of his wife in 1477. And because Margaret was not patrician, she was a member of the burgher class, Count Philip was not allowed to marry her. But they lived openly together and had 3 children. Now remember, good old Agostino Chigi in Rome, so this wasn't so unusual. And the inscription, which I am not going to read in German, but can translate, the male inscription says, "She did a good job, and I will make her very happy." And the female inscription says, "She who makes this ring loves you very much." So it's an image of their bond and their love, even though it was unlawful. They nevertheless lived openly and had children together. So I just thought this was an interesting contextual image to remind us that all sorts of different kinds of relationships existed in the Renaissance, even though it was a Catholic time. And with the Counter-Reformation later in the 16th century, things got a little stricter. All right. Entering into the 16th century, or almost into the 16th century, it's really important for Venetian painting that Dürer visited Venice twice. And I show you 2 portraits of Venetian women by Dürer in the middle and on the right, and one by Carpaccio that, if the dating is correct, precedes Dürer's visit. So you can see how Dürer was influenced by Venetian portraiture. And also I show you a little sliver detail of the woodcut we started with, because I find that these images of women by Carpaccio and Dürer relate very closely to how women were displayed at public celebrations. These are not women that we today would consider absolutely beautiful, and they do not conform to the Petrarch ideals that we're going to see a little bit later. I think they are much more naturalistic representation of perhaps actual Venetian women. But I also want to remind you that certain details can be missed by us today. So if we look at the Carpaccio portrait of a woman holding a book, that some art historians have said, oh, since she's holding a book, she must be a poet, and have possibly identified her as Girolama Corsi Ramos. I don't know how, because we have no other images of Girolama, but that cloth hanging behind her head is very similar to the cloth of honor that Giovanni Bellini frequently used in his images of Madonnas and children and child. So it is a kind of way of honoring. It's in a way of making a comparison or allusion from the sitter to the Virgin Mary, honoring her. She does not look out at us. She is holding probably a prayer book. This might have been marriage related because of the pearls adorning her clothing and the golden chain. We don't know anymore, but there are details that we in the 21st century would easily miss, like that cloth of honor, which also comes from royal portraiture, which was then adopted for the Virgin and Child, as the Virgin was the Queen of Heaven. And again, now Carpaccio seems to have been really a documenter of Venetians. When I went to the exhibit in Washington of Carpaccio, what particularly struck me were his drawings. So I showed 2 here, a head of a woman and 2 Turkish women, remembering again that Venice was a hub, an international hub of trade and diplomacy. And these 2 very interesting, very naturalistic. We really feel as if we would recognize these women on the street. His portrait of a Venetian woman from 1510 is showing us a new hairstyle. The hair is not down like that of a young bride. It seems to have been certain parts of it were trimmed and then the rest of it coiled on top. So a different kind of hairstyle, but again, we have chains and pearls. So perhaps these are images that were shared with fiancés to give, so they'd know who they were marrying. Now, in the Getty, there are this carpaccio of two women sitting on a balcony or on an altana, typically called two Venetian courtesans. And for a long time, it just hung on to that identification. And so I show you what Venetian courtesans looked like in 16th century Venice. Doesn't really help us identify the two ladies in the carpaccio. And if you look very closely at this image, there are very odd elements that should alert us to that this image is a fragment. So first, look at the snarling dog holding the leash in his teeth and his paws cut off holding Carpaccio's signature. So very unlikely that an artist would paint a fragmentary dog like that. And an even stronger clue is if you look on the balcony, the vase has something spouting up from it. And a clever art historian noticed that in the Corriere in Venice, there was a painting of Venetian hunting on the lagoon, which had a very unusual looking lily sticking at the lower end. So at the National Gallery in DC, these two were combined and would have formed, they were at some point in their history cut in half. So we know now that these two women on the Altana are there not as courtesans, but waiting for their husbands to return from their activity in the lagoon. And if we look at the ladies again, they show the same hairstyle that the Carpaccio portrait on the right shows, with that hair down and also coiled on top. They have slightly low cut dresses, but no indication that these would be considered courtesans. They're probably up there trying to lighten their hair to have the ideal Venetian or Titian blonde. And details such as the white handkerchief held by the woman in gold would possibly be a reference to purity, to chastity. Doves, very close by, to an image of love. Turtle doves, pearls, we always see seem to be marriage related. And dogs, particularly the little white one that's holding it, giving his paw to the woman in red, are the standard symbol of fidelity. And then even more clearly, if you look in the back, behind the parrot, there is a peahen, which in the Renaissance was a symbol of happy marriage. You also see the wonderful detail of the Venetian high-heeled shoes called zoccoli. This is how women increase their height. I think if I go back to the courtesan from the 1598, you see she is perched on extremely high zoccoli, and usually those women needed a page on either side of them to hold them up. And then if we look at the scene of hunting on the lagoon, there's some question as to what exactly is going on. I show you a Japanese woodcut print of Japanese using cormorants to hunt fish. The birds would have a ring around their neck so that they would not be able to swallow the fish. But we're not sure that that's what's going on here. We have a description by James Howell, a visiting Englishman to Venice in the 17th century, saying The pleasures, recreations, and pastimes of the Venetian gentlemen are of diverse kinds. Among the rest, they take great delight, and I can't see that word, using, I think, matches who can kill the most. They would compete in matches of who could kill the most fowl in a day. They have boats of purpose called fissolari, so named for Fisolo, which is the name of the bird they seek after. In every of these boats, they have 6 or 8 servants who row the boat up and down, turning her suddenly to every side as they are commanded by their master, who sits close with his piece, gun, or bow, wholly attentive upon his sport. If he chance to miss what he shooteth, the Fizzle dives under the water, and where he rises again, thither they turn their boats with much nimbleness. So I'm going to give you a detail in a second. So this is clearly a patrician activity. We can tell also by their tights and their multicolored tights and tunics. And so it's either the Japanese or Chinese version of using cormorants, or it is using hunting grebes, because look at this. It does not seem that the birds are hunting fish, because we have dead birds, it seems. I think those are dead birds on the bow of the ship. Perhaps those are limp fish. It's hard to tell. But what we do know is happening is that they are not shooting arrows. They are shooting pellets. And that big arrow on the right is pointing at a bird in the water and a pellet. And the pellet seems to be aimed at fish. And we see that they don't have arrows, but they are aiming into the water where the birds are and perhaps the fish. So I'm not absolutely sure what's going on. I would say in the background is probably a place where they breed fish, and you see that they are back there as well. I love the detail of the swans flying off in the distance. I think I have a detail of that. So again, Carpaccio is an extraordinary painter of Venetian life. I love on the boat on the right, you see one of the cormorants seated on the edge of the boat, and you see the guy with the bow and arrow, with the bow without the arrow, he's shooting pellets. And then on the back, there is this wonderful painting on the back of the landscape of trompe-l'oeil letters hung on a cord with the name of Andrea Mocenigo. So it would seem likely that this formed part of furniture in the Mocenigo Palazzo, and that we are missing, do I have another detail now? We're missing, hold on, where do I have the most? We're missing the left side of the door and the back of the right side. So just as we saw that those horizontal paintings were often inset into wood paneling, this was probably a part of a cupboard. Okay, what time is it? We should take a break now before we look at Titian's first portrait of a woman known as La Schiavona. So let's just take a 5-minute break and we'll come back. I will stop sharing and look at chat. So let's stop share. Oh, I agree with you. His paintings are lovingly painted. Well, let's see if we think he was lovingly painting La Schiavona. But I find her fascinating. But again, I'm working on a proposal for next year on Titian because I just love the way he paints. She could be a madam. Which one are you talking about? Because of Venus of Urbino. Which one? Hundertwasser. Which madam?
Yes.
Do you think? Are we talking about the Venus of Urbino?
No, we're talking about the ugly one.
The ugly one
With the receding hairline.
Oh, the ugly one.
And I am also wondering whether that receding hairline was not some sort of a fashion to indicate some intellect.
We know they did. We know already in the 15th century that women plucked their brows,
Yeah.
to have higher foreheads to indicate intellect. Yes. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that's what she looks like. She might have lost hair. And I don't know, I have to go back and look at what are the signs of syphilis, whether you start to lose your hair, and whether you could possibly treat it with sunburn. I mean, I just find it an absolutely fascinating, not very pretty image. I mean, so I come back to, why was this painted? Who wanted this image? It's, to me, such a unlikely image to find. That's why I wonder whether it was paired with a contrasting image. So kind of as, if you behave badly, you'll end up like this, kind of like the Giorgione.
But the other thing is that the frequenters of brothels would want the houses to be run well.
Oh, you mean so madam of a house? Yeah.
Yeah, that she is a madam.
But who would commission her portrait? And wouldn't she want to look better? Just wondering.
Well, I don't know that the madam would have much control over.
But who would pay the artist then? That's
maybe a group of men who frequent the brothel.
Maybe, I don't know. See, this throws us into our confusion. But I like to leave you in there. I mean, I'm not trying to tie it up because I don't have the answers. But I think it's really interesting to think about such questions. Who would commission that picture?
Agreed.
Yeah. So I see whose hand is up. Alejandro.
Happy Valentine's Day, Professor Evers.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you a quick question about the Carpaccio and Dürer right before the break. Carpaccio was in the 15th century. Dürer came into the 16th century at 1505.
Carpaccio continued to paint.
Yeah. So my question is, when Dürer, coming from the north, came into Venice, he was looking at painting realism of women, and the two paintings that he showed of Dürer were not of ugly women, but of real women, which was exactly, which was real for both Carpaccio and for Dürer in Venice. Mm-hmm. Because Venice was a woman who led in the era of trade that was dynamic, because the Venetians were in power. Yeah. Were they not in the 15th century? Not anymore?
What?
Okay.
No, yes, absolutely. Venice doesn't start to recede in power until the mid-century. But
mid-century,
Venetian women were not in power.
No, but the image of the Venetian throne,
the image of Venice as justice, yes,
as justice. But you mentioned the lion's throne, which was the symbol of religion, because Mark in Venice,
yes,
is the lion's throne.
But the lion throne was that of Solomon. It was the throne of wisdom. So
exactly, which transcends from the Byzantine era to the Venetian moment in the 16th century.
Okay, but I don't think that relates to Dürer's and Carpaccio's images.
It's a stretch. But it's a good stretch because you've been highlighting Manet.
Well,
Manet is in the 18th century, which is an amazing transition for you to 19th century, which is Olympia comes into play.
Exactly.
Because Olympia in these 15th century, 16th century images of women where you started with Venus and Cupid and playful, and whether it was wisdom or whether it was sensuous, the language you've used is very enlightening, because the Venetians were enlightened by the 16th century in terms of art.
Well, we could say Italians were enlightened. That we're in the High Renaissance period. So
exactly.
Let's dive back into the 16th century, okay?
And we'll dive back because it's a beautiful first half. I love it. Thank you. Happy Valentine's Day.
It's now going to get more beautiful. But I like to share complicated images. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna present you with another puzzle. Titian's Slavic woman, the Schiavona, or the slave. It's a later title. It has nothing to do with this woman. But once again, what's interesting to me is I don't think we could call this idealized. What is very unusual is her direct gaze at us, which seems to have a term that I find hard to pronounce, scopophilia, which means mutual gazing. So we are encouraged by Titian to engage in a relationship with this woman. She's looking out at us proudly, I would say, and yet she is kept at a distance behind that parapet, which is where we started, that whole northern tradition of the parapet. But Titian has made it different, and he did it in two stages. The carved portrait bust on the right, he raised that parapet. It was not originally planned to be like that. And I just, here's some wonderful images of these Venetian high heels, the zoccoli. And again, reminding us of the historical reality of women in Venice. They were secluded. Patrician women were not allowed out and about, except when accompanied and except in public ceremonies. And then they, as I showed you, they were paraded out for state rituals in these unbelievable zoccoli. So our first question, is this a portrait? She certainly seems to be an individual, but some scholars have proposed that she is the same as the woman in red in his very early fresco in The Miracle of the Speaking Babe in the Scuola del Santo in Padua. Now, I would just comment here that La Schiavona has dark brown hair and the lady in red has Titian blonde or strawberry blonde hair. So I don't find this a particularly compelling comparison, although scholars have said, isn't it interesting that both these images of kind of powerful, proud women are painted in association with sculpture? I think that's a stretch. So let's put her in the context of contemporary portraits. This is an early Titian, so he is still associated with Giorgione. And Giorgione is a most mysterious painter. Very few paintings are universally ascribed to him. This portrait of a young man, I think it's in Vienna, has vacillated in its attribution. But I'm using this as an example because of that parapet with the inscription VV and the hand just resting on the top of the parapet. So Titian has adopted this. And again, I think there's something to be said about the desire to separate the image of the sitter from us, to make sure that the boundary between paint and reality is not blurred. And he doesn't use VV, he uses TV, which is his name, Tiziano Vecellio. It probably relates, it's probably a reference to the use of VV by both Dürer and Giorgione, which seems to relate to vivo vivis or virtu vincit. So emphasizing the lifelikeness of the sitter, or that this was painted from life, or that virtue is victorious, virtue wins all. This is at a time when portraits are still rare. We don't know who she is. She's a powerhouse. She's a very strong woman with, clear sense of herself as she looks at us. And it has also been proposed that she perhaps is deceased because of that profile sculpted image of her under her hand, or that this is Titian competing with sculpture. And I would say in this painting clearly proclaims the supremacy of paint, since the painted image of this woman is so much more dramatic and powerful than the profile sculpture. Show you another painting of a Venetian gentleman that has bounced around in attributions from Giorgione to Titian to Cariani, with again a VVO, Virtus Vincut Omnia, or as painted from life. And I like these two together. They are both incredibly powerful images of an individual. And that would lead me to want to ascribe the Venetian gentleman to Titian, unless it's Giorgione and Titian is really adopting Giorgione's style. But I'm just putting this in the context of the moment, and to remind you how very unusual this image of this woman is. She's standing 3/4 length. No woman at this time had been painted like that. Only men were painted at 3/4 length, standing, leaning with their arms on a parapet or a stone ledge. And so I wonder whether this was perhaps not a commission. Could Titian have painted this to display in his studio, basically to advertise his skill? Because I think it's most unusual that we have no idea who she is, and that she is unique at the moment. She is absolutely in the same category as Titian's male portraits. So just a suggestion, and reminding you that Alberti said, painting contains a divine force which not only makes men present, as friendship is said to, but moreover makes the dead seem almost alive. The face of a man who is already dead certainly lives a long life through painting. Well, certainly this woman, if we knew who she was, has lived a long life. He has captured her and brought her to life, whether she is deceased, whether she is Titian marketing his skills as superior as a painter to sculpture. And this starts a whole trend of images of women. And I show you this Palma Vecchio. I'm going to show you another, her again. But again, this tradition of placing them behind a parapet. We don't know what AMB stands for, but ND seems to be Nobel Donna, patrician woman. And she's an unusual image as well, because there's no jewelry. Also, we begin to see that these ladies are dyeing their hair. So notice that her part is a much darker color than the curls brought up over her ears. And we're going to see some examples of that as well. But the Palma Vecchio seems not to be a portrait, but seems to be this whole tradition that I'm going to show you many examples of these beautiful women. Now, we have to stop for a minute, because this is when this totally captured my amazement. I would not, if I were shown these two portraits, I would not think they were painted by the same artist. The one on the right of Laura Eustachia Dianti is more in keeping with later Titian, but it's just the range of his skill and the range of how he painted portraits is extraordinary. And so, as I've said before, when something is unusual, we better dive into it. So La Schiavona on the left is not unusual except for that she's standing and powerful, but there's a whole tradition of Giorgione, Dürer, and Palmavecchio portraits with which she sits. But the Laura Dianti just screams as being unusual, especially when I compare her to the standard portraits of patrician women. The Raphael Giulio Romano portrait of Donna Isabel de Bresquens, who was the vicereine of Naples from 1518, or Titian's portrait of Eleonora Gonzaga, or even, as we've seen, his portrait of Giulio Varano. Very different than this loosely painted, voluptuous, I would say confusing image of a woman with a star crown and an Ethiopian page. So let's keep going to see if we can figure out some other elements to this portrait. So we know she was the mistress of Alfonso d'Este. She claimed that he married her just before he died, and that these two portraits were commissioned as a pair. And they're not quite the same size, but there certainly are elements that make them read as a pair. And we know later in the 17th century, the portrait on the left of Laura was used as evidence against her status as wife of Alfonso d'Este, because the lawyers claimed that no bride, no legitimate wife would be painted like this. The defending lawyer said, but of course this was painted before they were married, so it's not relevant. So now let's look a little bit more closely. The first thing that I want to draw your attention to are her right hand and his left hand. They both have the same gesture of the upside down V. So I've been digging around for what is the meaning of the upside down V. And it seems to have something to do, a sexual illusion, that if you combine a V with an A, it's one is the female, one is the male. It also highlights the fourth finger, which is the marriage finger. But what really strikes me here is how these two hands mirror each other, as if they are going to reach out to join each other. And he rests his right hand on a cannon, and she rests her left hand on this Ethiopian page, which most people would claim is a symbol of status. And yes, there were pages, Africans and people of color, not necessarily as slaves, but as servants. And then if we keep looking at her, we have to learn a little bit more about her. In a document, Alfonso stated that he met her in 1526 and was so captivated by her beautiful face that he sought through an intermediary to persuade her parents to bring them together, promising that the relationship would benefit everyone. So she arrives in Ferrara, and he builds her a palazzetto. He doesn't move her into the palace, which is another argument against her status as wife. In addition, she was also not buried with the other members of the Este family. She was buried separately. And she was probably painted by Titian when he was in Ferrara between 1527 and 1528, or again for an extended visit in 1529. For in 1527, she gave birth to a son, which he was named Alfonso. And Alfonso adopted him as his heir as well. After he died, Alfonso died, Laura hired the infamous Pietro Aretino to advertise her marriage to Alfonso. He was writing letters to all the prominent kind of patricians throughout Italy. And she wanted to use him to promote her legitimacy. In addition, after he died, she took the Estense name. Also, her name was probably not her original name. So when Alfonso met her, she probably had a different name. And he gave her the names of Laura, probably referencing Petrarch's beloved, and the name Eustochia as a reference to the Roman virgin Eustochium, who was a follower of Saint Jerome. So could that finger V be virtue? Could we be living in a realm of ambiguity between the incredible sensuosity of this painting and the name proclamations that associate her with virtue and virginity? And again, what is wrapped around her bodice and neck but a yellow scarf? This scarf truly drives me nuts, because is it a sign of a courtesan, or is it not? Is it a golden scarf, rather to be beautiful and to complement the royal blue and to complement the multi-striped tunic of the page? I leave this to you. I don't have answers, but I find it fascinating. So she also doesn't wear any jewelry except that headdress, which has what's called a hat badge in the center of the pearl leaves. And a hat badge was typically a male adornment. So what are we seeing here? She's standing, which is typical for men. She has a hat badge, and she also is wearing an earring. We assume two, but perhaps only one earring. And as I said before, earrings were not in fashion until after 1530 and were the sign of the exotic. And notice that her page has an earring as well. And I also give you a little detail about who was looking for African servants: Isabella d'Este, Eleanor of Aragon, and Alfonso himself had a black groom as well. And if you remember when we were talking about Leonardo's portrait of Cecilia Garrani, we talked a bit about the unstable position of a mistress, that complex status. She could be discarded at any time. And somewhat like that of the page. So we have this extraordinary complementary relationship between the Ethiopian page, who looks up adoringly in a way, in admiration of this woman with the crown, the star crown. And so we are in this incredibly ambiguous realm of virtue and virginity and sensuality and mistress, and all displayed in this lusciousness of paint. And I come back to that hand gesture. I'm going to spend some time digging around to see if I can find out more about that hand gesture, because you're going to see it in some other paintings as well. And just look at the detail of this African page. The paint is extraordinary, and the colors in his tunic certainly complement and highlight the colors of her garments as well. And that brilliant blast of white above her heart and on her sleeve highlight the difference, I think, in skin color as well. All right, one of my favorites, also complex and ambiguous, is Giorgione's Laura. We know nothing about Giorgione. He continues to be more of a mystery than Vermeer. We know he was influenced by Leonardo. That's why I have Ginevra there, because Leonardo came to Venice in 1500. And he circulated with a scholarly literary crowd, Taddeo Contarini, Girolamo Marcello, the patron of Giorgione's Reclining Venus, Gabriele Vendramon, Vernier, Pietro Bembo. All these men who were writing beautiful sonnets about women. On the reverse of the painting, there is an inscription that clearly identifies it as that of Giorgione, because if you look at Maestro Zorzi da Chastel, refers to Giorgione from Castelfranco. And it's possibly was commissioned by Giacomo Anselmi, who was a respected patrician and fur trader, which would explain the exquisite inclusion of the fur trimmed, it looks like a men's coat, like almost like an at-home robe, which contributes to the incredible sensuality of this image. Now, of course, you've noticed her bare breast, but I just want to remind you that a bare breast was not only possible for a courtesan. We're going to see that argument further, but I just wanted to remind you of the tradition of the nursing Madonna, going back to the goes back to Byzantine art, but I show you a 15th century example, two 15th century examples, the Leonardo becoming more naturalistic, and the Raphael almost naughty, as baby Jesus, now truly a baby, is reaching his hand under the garment of his mother. Endearing, natural, and one could say sensual as well. I also want to show you this image that shows the Giorgione Laura, which seems possibly to have been cut down, unless the artist here in the circled one extended it down farther. It looks like originally her left arm was included in the image as well, with her hand resting on her abdomen, which could be absolutely a reference to hoped for pregnancy or pregnancy, if you think of the Arnolfini marriage scene as well. Okay, so, but that bare breast got this poor woman called a courtesan constantly, and she's probably not. She doesn't read to me like what I would imagine a courtesan would be, how a courtesan would be depicted. Furthermore, I still ask the question, who would be commissioning these portraits of courtesans? They certainly couldn't have been hung in the marital bedchamber. That wouldn't encourage a relationship. And there's a whole nother tradition of the bared breast that could refer to an open-hearted acceptance of the husband, of this husband's advances, a consent to relations. And so it seems much more likely to me that this would have been painted in connection to a marriage. And her name would have been Laura. That's why there's laurel behind her, just as in the Leonardo. And that I can totally imagine this painting hanging in the bridal chamber. And just to remind us that I know we like to tie everything up and say this is what it means. I have a wonderful quotation from the 15th century from Giovanni Aurelio Ugarelli about Botticelli's banner for the joust of Giuliano de' Medici. You ask me, Bernardo Bembo, why it is that on the sign of Giuliano de' Medici, love should be painted with his hands tied behind his back. Some give one explanation and others another. No one is of the same opinion, so that it is the most beautiful of painted images. So there we have it, someone right then and there saying, well, no one can agree on what it means, but everybody can agree that it is beautiful. So I would leave this with you, that we all can agree that this is one of the most beautiful images, sensual images. Look at how that transparent scarf wraps around her breast, and her breast is highlighted against the texture of the fur. She looks off into space. She's not looking at us seductively. She's deep into thought. She's not the typical ideal beauty with blonde hair. this must be an individual. And again, I remind you of the multiple interpretations. A courtesan, I don't think so. A virtuous bride, very likely. And if it was cut down, and it would have been an image of pregnancy, hoped for pregnancy, or perhaps if it wasn't painted around a marriage, perhaps it was painted around childbirth, and the bare breasts could relate to breastfeeding. And of course, the name Laura takes us to Petrarch's Laura and the myth of Apollo and Daphne, again about virtue. Daphne turned into a laurel tree to avoid the advances of Apollo. So I leave you with this image, and complicated by contrasting interpretations. And now I'm going to really throw a wrench into everything, because from the right at the same time as this painting, there is a series of stories by Niccolo Liburnio called Le Selvette, dedicated to Isabella d'Este. So in that same circle of bemboites, he has a fictional account of an adultery trial using an unidentified Bellini painting as evidence, claiming that it showed of a man fondling a woman's breast, thus demonstrating the adulterous nature and the unwanted attention of this man. So I show you this painting above of exactly emulating the text from Liburnio, which I give you a whole long quotation. I'm not going to read the whole thing, just the last part. Now let us look finally at how with such languor and lasciviousness the weary hand of the noble lover handles at his pleasure the right breast of the robust adulteress, for whom it was not sufficient to indulge in the most avid delights of the body in secret, but that she wants to show them openly, painted in full color. So here are just an assortment. I'm going to show you many more of the images that started to proliferate in the 16th century in Venice of bare-breasted women, men fondling them, and these threesomes that I find quite disturbing. If we look at this one by Paris Bordone called The Lovers, I find this very hard to imagine that this is a man proposing and the guy lurking in the background is the witness. It doesn't seem that way to me. But then again, I'm a 21st century person and I don't understand all the physical languages of the 16th century. But there's something, to me, a little untoward of this threesome. There is an exchange of a gift of the necklace, but what is that figure lurking in the shadows behind doing? But we're going to see several more. But first, we're going to see this beginning of kind of Bellini's this is painted at the very end of his career, and it begins a tradition of showing a woman at her toilette with a mirror. And forever, I have assumed that this related to the Paragone, that by including here two mirrors, Bellini was challenging sculpture, that yes, you can walk around a sculpture and see it from every angle, but a painter can show you multiple angles by including mirrors. And it is inscribed on that cartellino, Johannes Bellini's Facciabat is making this in 1515. So that Facciabat makes a correlation between Bellini and the famous Greek painter Apelles. So let's look at her. This is again, one of my favorite paintings. She does not have the overt sensuality of a Titian, but there is this timeless quality of beauty and quiet that is extraordinary. And I think argues against interpreting this as a symbol of vanity or prudence. Rather, I think there is an eternity to this image, a timelessness to this image that introduces us to the subject of beautiful women in the 16th century. And I have a excerpt from a poem, "O proud lady, why do you trust a glass? If you wish to well understand your beauty, reflect yourself in me, since your beauty is as grand as my passion, which exceeds any other." And it's in keeping with this Tullio Lombardo couple, formerly called Bacchus and Ariadne, because it's sculpture, we have to give it a mythological title. But I think, as we saw in the Titian portrait of La Schiavona, sculptures were beginning to represent contemporary individuals as well. And this seems to be probably commissioned a married couple, but commissioning it in sculpture as perhaps more surviving than that of paint. But then I compare it to I find disturbing painting by an artist I've never heard of, Altobello Malone, calling that a loving couple. That doesn't seem to be a loving couple to me. There you see he has a hat badge on his hat. I find the most disturbing aspect of this that her necklace is askew and that his glove has a hole in the finger. So this, I haven't spent enough time kind of thinking and looking at this picture, but very different than either the Bellini or the Tullio Lombardo, but just giving you a sense of how many of these paintings were being commissioned. I look at the Bellini very much as part of this literary circle. And here is a Bembo portrait. "Oh, my heavenly and pure image that shines brighter than the sun in my eyes. You resemble the face of heaven, which I have chiseled in my heart with much care. And as a woman of sweet and humble appearance, you are willing to have pity on my torment. Like Petrarch's Laura, who sits thoughtful in the window, whoever wishes to see all that nature and heaven can do among us, let him come and gaze on her. For she alone is the sun, not merely for my eyes, but for the blind world." Now, one other interpretation which I find fascinating, and I haven't quite figured out what I'm going to do with it, is Rona Goffin, now deceased, was a brilliant art historian, and I tend to agree with many of her interpretations. But this one mystifies me a little bit. She says this image is an impersonification of the contrasting wifely duties, modesty and sexual devotion. In other words, the Madonna horror complex. And it depicts the moment she gets her hair in order and transitions from virgin bride to wife. In other words, the bride would have her hair down, and as she becomes wife, she puts her hair up. I'm going to leave that with you. I think for me, that's a bit of a stretch here. I see this much more evocative of the poetry coming out of the Bembo and Petrarch circles. But it introduces us to this tradition of a woman with a mirror, which clearly begins either with Titian or Bellini. Did 80-year-old Bellini begin it, or did Titian start it and Bellini adopt it to say, hey, I might be old, but I'm still in the run. Was this a studio composition to engender conversation, to engender further commissions? Is it a competition between these two, very young Titian and the very old Bellini? But when we look at the Titian, we are taken into much more than with the Bellini, into this complex engaging of glances. So we have the guy holding the mirror, actually holding both mirrors as she looks into it and sees what her hair looks like in the back. We have a slightly undone garment, but really the emphasis seems to be on the oiling of her hair. on the emphasis on her hair. And all those interpretations by scholars who want to identify these figures just doesn't work for me. Titian and his mistress, Alfonso d'Este and Laura Dianti, Federico Gonzala and Isabella Moschetti, a hairdresser and his client. No, come on. I mean, this is art historians just really seeking unnecessary answers. Now, one of the issues I want you to think about is that the multiplicity of these images. I show you 3 different versions, none of them anywhere near as good as the original Titian. One having taken all the clothes off, and I had to bring in Freud's comment about the progressive concealment of the body keeps sexual curiosity awake. And yes, I agree with him in that the nude is far less sensuous than the clothed. But why the popularity of this image? So this must have been on the open market. People must have been collecting these images or commissioning copies of the original. And again, it relates, I think, to the revival of Petrarch's poetry. She let her gold hair scatter in the breeze and twined it in 1,000 sweet knots, and wavering light beyond measure would burn in those beautiful eyes which are now so dim. And it seemed to me her face wore the color of pity. I do not know whether false or true. I, who had the lure of love in my breast, what wonder if I suddenly caught fire? Her way of moving was no mortal thing, but of angelic form, and her speech rang higher than a mere human voice. A celestial spirit, a living sun, was what I saw. And if she is not such now, the wound's not healed, although the bow is slack. So if these were commissioned or bought up by many Venetian patricians, I wonder whether these were not conversation pieces and whether they were not intended to inspire the writing and the reciting of poetry. I'm not going to read this Pietro Bembo of those fair tresses that I love more and more, about how tortured he is by the beauty and the sensuality of the hair as an ensnaring noose, the power of women over these men who fall in love with them. And here's Titian's portrait of possibly Pietro Bembo, and a description by Gian Giorgio Trissino of her hair fell to her delicate milk white shoulders. It was gathered in a snood of tawny silk, worked with great artistry, whose threads seemed of the finest gold. And through the loops, which were rather large, her hair shone like sunbeams bursting forth, illuminating everything around her. I think it is these poems that elucidate these images. Then we have this odd painting by Bernardino Licinio of the 3 ages of man. That would be the older man, the middle-aged man, and the child, with this woman with dyed blonde hair. And hair lightener in Venice, often urine, was described as acqua di Giovedi, Friday water. And they would sit on the Altana with their hair spread out over these wide-brimmed hats without the crown to bleach their hair. So it's all about the hair that ensnares a man's heart. And the gazing, she looks into the mirror to see the hair behind, but also to see he looks at her, she looks back at him through the mirror. And this started a whole trend. I show you this, one of the most beautiful paintings ever, Titian's Venus with a Mirror. We know it's Venus because there's Cupid holding the mirror for Venus and another little Cupid about to crown her with flowers. The incredible sensuality of her body and the fur. And then look at this. So this is what explains things to me, that there were this many and more versions. this was an incredibly popular image, so that there was a style of, I don't know where these hung. Were they all hung in marriage chambers? Were they hung in the men's studiolo where the guys could write poetry about this? Someday maybe we'll discover, but it is this kind of image proliferation that I think tells us that these are not portraits, that these were incredibly in fashion, possibly because of the profusion of famous Venetian courtesans. And I just show you a Veronese version that makes me very uncomfortable because that head does not belong to that body, and a Tintoretto Venus in a Mirror. We'll return to these maybe next year, because we enter into this idealized beauty. So we have another profusion of these blonde women, bust length or 3/4 length, where they can all conform to an ideal of beauty. The hair must be long and fair, of a soft yellow turning brown. The skin light and clear, but not pale. The eyes dark brown, large and somewhat vaulted. Their sclera shimmeringly blue. The nose ought not to be curved, as aquiline noses do not suit women. The mouth should be small, the lips round, the chin round with a dimple. It goes on. So here we have a profusion. I don't have time to I will send this out with the next outline. These poets, all conforming to the poetry of the time and the imagery of the time. And I'm just going to go rather quickly because, as usual, we're running out of time. I just want to show you the profusion of images of beautiful women, not only by Titian, but also by Palma Vecchio and Paris Bordone. So here is, just for 2 seconds, I want you to hear a little excerpt from the madrigal. I hope it plays. I hope you can hear it. Golden tresses, oh so precious, you bind in 1,000 ways. Coiled or flowing freely, small white matching pearls, and the roses that conceal you, reveal you, you wound me. So here we are, these wounding women who snare their men. Where did these hang? It fascinates me. Are these related to marriage? Are these lovers' gifts? Are these evocations of poetry? We don't know. But look here, Titian's Violante, so-called because of the violet tucked into her bosom. But look at the woman as Saint Catherine. Is it the same woman? Were these models? And Titian using them to paint popular images that were filling patrician palaces. Unusually, this one is painted in black, so I found poetry that talks about beautiful women in black gowns. Or here, this has been identified as the allegory of vanity, because rather than looking at herself in the mirror, she displays the jewelry and aspects of vanitas. Again, we see a yellow scarf. Does that mean she's a courtesan? Is she expecting someone? What's about to happen? All these questions. I think they are real teases for conversation, poetry writing, eroticism, and this more than any of them. Titian's Flora is one of the most beautiful paintings ever, because we're caught in this moment. Is she about to cover her breast? Is she about to uncover the breast? To whom is she offering the flowers? Look at that finger gesture. Is that virtue or is that vulva? Is it an invitation to sex, or is this a marriage image intended for the bedroom? And again, then the argument is that many courtesans were called Flora. So is this a courtesan? I prefer not to think of this as a courtesan, because again, I don't understand who these were painted for. But if these were just images to inspire poetry, and perhaps sex, then they could be images of courtesans, but not necessarily as courtesans, not portraits. And I show you this detail, the lusciousness of his pigment, as you just see the hint of her nipple and the golden tresses of her hair that fall over her shoulders. Nothing could be more sensual than this image. Is she the same one as in Sacred and Profane Love? It's pretty similar. So are these models? No, I do not believe these are Titian's mistresses or his wife Cecilia. I bet it makes sense that these were models and then sold perhaps in the open market. So I'm just going to show you a whole profusion of Palma Vecchio blondes. The one on the left, both of them have darker roots, so they've been highlighting their hair. Or this odd painting by Lucinio. This seems to be painted in a marital context as he devotes himself to her, as he takes her wrist. But we're not sure. This makes more sense to hang perhaps in a marriage chamber. Or this image of a portrait of a woman bearing her breast, which seems to be the same woman who is the wife of the artist's brother. So again, what women could pose? Here we have a very proper family portrait and seemingly the same woman in this evocative pose bearing her breast. Or this poem, this painting by Titian, which I think is meant to be ambiguous. It has been given all sorts of specific identifications, like, is that a portrait of Alfonso Dalvos? Probably not. It seems to be an image relating to marriage, but one about which poems could be written and stories could be written and evening entertainment could surround. This is pretty clear. You don't get any sexier than this late Titian of Mars and Venus, I think painted for Rudolph II. And then very quickly, because we're out of time, I wanted you to see what happens later. Paris Bordone went to the court of Francis I in France and then returned to Venice. And I just painted this series of very odd images. This could very easily be a marriage image. The Mars looks to be more portrait-like than the women, especially when I show you the profusion of Bordone's overly coiffed, semi-nude blonde women. And again, that older man, is this following in the tradition of ill-matched lovers? Or here, again, very strange painting. He's not very good at musculature or breasts, I might say. He needs a model. More images called Venus and Mars with Cupid in between. This possibly painted when he was in France. So did some of these bare-breasted intentions come out of the court of Francis I? I showed you the strange images from Fontainebleau of bare-breasted women pinching their nipples. Just increasing examples of the same female with odd golden tresses. Here again, multitudes of these images. Some with bare breasts, some were with not. And that comes to the end. I'm finally actually reaching the end on time. This is supposedly a portrait of the most famous courtesan, honest courtesan in Venice, Veronica Franco, who was a poet, a renowned poet. She was married, divorced. She demanded the return of her dowry. She associated with artists and patricians, particularly a frequent guest of Domenico Venier. She was chosen by Henry III of France for a one-night stand. She was arraigned by the Inquisition and acquitted. And of course, she was the subject of one of my favorite movies, Dangerous Beauty. And if you haven't seen it, go watch it because it takes place in Venice, one of the few films filmed in Venice. And I just want to show you another image. A woman revealing her breasts. Is this also Veronica Franco? And is this again about poetry, about sensuality, intended to be seductive, and perhaps coupled with this image of the proper clothed woman? Are these the same women? Is the revealing of the breast not at all intended to be sensual, even though it is, but is it about speaking honestly and openly and sincerely from the heart? Uncovering the breast, concealing the heart, hiding one's thought, and concealing our intentions. And the more I look at these images, I love actually going through these images with you because it makes me think as I talk. And I really see these so evocative of the writing of poetry, of the singing of madrigals, of the world of sensuality that 16th century Venetian patricians were living. And I leave you with this comparison, all about hair and all about the breasts. And just to remind you that the penitent Mary Magdalene was commissioned by Federico Gonzaga for Vittoria Colonna, who then gave it to his mother or his wife, Eleonora Gonzaga, and described the Magdalene as aglow with her burning passion for Christ. So I had to leave you with a really complex comparison of two beautiful Titian or Tintoretto women bearing their breasts. Okay, I hope I see there are chats. I will do my best to answer. So let's see chats. Okay. Oh, why the lawyers and evidence more than 100? Oh, it was this descendants. They didn't want her offspring. So it was her grandson was claiming to be a legitimate Este, and his legitimacy was being challenged, and that portrait was used as evidence. Fascinating how it's all about money, right? And inheritance and land. She, which one is wearing the ring? Again, it's the same. This could be an advertisement. Softman, it's a fur. Yes, if he's a fur trader, I think that makes absolute sense. And I also think it's a marriage. If we're talking about Laura, I think that makes sense as a marriage image. The left arm on the last Bellini of the woman is so, yeah, right. Some of these artists had arm problems. He was 80 years old. And I will tell you, particularly Veronese has some limb problems, or like that Veronese Venus, the head kind of out of proportion with the body and not placed comfortably on that neck. Art historians don't like to talk about the difficult aspects of some paintings. I always tend to notice them. Okay, yes, I'm wondering whether the models, which seem to be many of the same women, I'm wondering whether the models were courtesans, but that the images, I'm not sure, were intended to be viewed as portraits of courtesans or even images of courtesans, but that proper women couldn't model with bare breasts. So I would imagine that the courtesans could be the models, but I don't believe the images were intended as portraits or images of courtesans. I'm much more inclined to believe these were poetic inspirations. Oh yes, I'm going to Fontainebleau in April, and I know very little about the school of Fontainebleau, the paintings that come out of Fontainebleau, but I am dying to learn more because there's such weird ones that come out of there. But it's, of course, it's all the Mannerists who went to the court of Francis I. So, but there's something about bare-breasted women pinching their nipples. I'm finding it very odd. And so I'm going to try and learn more about it. Okay, I see two hands, Alejandro and Virginia. Virginia, why don't you go first?
That actually was my question. There are several paintings from the School of Fontainebleau up at the Legion of Honor, and they're all a little different like that. That's why I asked.
Okay, yes. So I have some work to do. I think I need to escape into Titian for a while because I really prefer beauty, but those are odd, and I'm going to look at them when I'm in France. Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Sonny. My question is not really a question. I just wanted to find out from you the Titian and the Bellini period. Titian was a student of Bellini.
Briefly, very
Briefly.
briefly. Yes.
When Titian changed his palette to the mirrors, like the lady with a mirror at the National Gallery, that was right in the Bellini era because it was early Titian.
So that's early Titian.
Right.
And then we have the last Bellini from 1515 of the Venus with the mirror.
Right.
So with the mirror. So the question is, who inspired whom? I have a gut feeling that Titian may have inspired Bellini, and Bellini was competitive, wanting to still claim dominance in the market. Because that Titian is not painted in a Bellini-esque style.
Thank you. Have a great week.
All right, thanks. All right, everybody, bye. Next week, no, the next two lectures are very different. Next week is a bevy of female artists, and the last one is Artemisia Gentileschi, just Artemisia. So we're changing our tune and looking at female artists. I'll see you next week.